The crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Promise Creek, and Harriet Monroe instinctively ducked behind an overturned wagon, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild Mustang. The year was 1876, and the West was still as untamed as the wind that howled across the open plains, carrying with it the scent of danger and possibility. Harriet's trembling fingers clutched the small bundle in her arms tighter, a 6-month-old baby boy with a shock of dark hair and eyes that reminded her of the endless Wyoming sky. Thomas wasn't even her child, but the dying wishes of his mother, Harriet's dearest friend, had placed him in her care just 3 days prior. Now, as bullets flew overhead and the bank robbery unfolded mere yards away, Harriet wondered if they would live to see another sunrise. "Stay down," a deep voice commanded, and suddenly a broad-shouldered figure was beside her, the brim of his worn Stetson pulled low over intense gray eyes. Dust clung to his leather vest and denim trousers, and the revolver in his hand looked as natural as an extension of his arm. "When I give the word, you run for that alley. Don't look back." Harriet nodded, unable to find her voice as another volley of gunfire erupted. The stranger returned fire, his movements fluid and practiced. In the momentary lull that followed, he turned to her. "Now," he ordered, and Harriet sprang to her feet, clutching Thomas to her chest as she ran for the narrow space between buildings. She didn't stop until she reached the end of the alley, lungs burning and legs weak. The sounds of chaos had faded somewhat, but still she pressed herself against the rough wooden wall, using her body to shield the baby. Thomas, miraculously, had remained quiet throughout the ordeal, his tiny fingers curled around the fabric of her travel-worn dress. Minutes stretched like hours before the sound of approaching footsteps made her tense once more. The stranger appeared, holstering his weapon with a practiced flick of his wrist. "You're safe now, madam," he said, his voice gentler than before. "Those outlaws won't be troubling anybody else." "Thank you," Harriet managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "No need for that," he interrupted. Then his gaze fell to the bundle in her arms. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the edges of his weathered face. "Your boy." Harriet hesitated, then shook her head. "His mother was my friend. She passed 3 days ago. Consumption." The stranger nodded, understanding darkening his eyes. "You got somewhere to go?" Again, she hesitated. The truth was, she didn't. She'd used the last of her money on the stagecoach fare to Promise Creek, hoping to find work as a teacher. But the town was smaller than she'd been led to believe, and with a baby in tow, her prospects seemed increasingly dim. "I thought I did," she admitted finally. The man studied her for a long moment, taking in her dusty traveling clothes, the exhaustion that must have been evident in every line of her face. Then he removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. "Name's Lucas Blackwood," he said. "I've got a place about 5 miles outside of town. Nothing fancy, but there's a spare room and it's quiet. Safe. You're welcome to stay until you figure things out." Under normal circumstances, Harriet would never have considered accepting such an offer from a stranger. But these weren't normal circumstances. She was alone in an unfamiliar town with a baby who depended on her, and this man had just saved both their lives. "I'm Harriet Monroe," she replied. "And this is Thomas." Lucas nodded, replacing his hat. "Got a wagon at the livery. We can head out now if you're ready." And that was how Harriet found herself seated beside the taciturn gunman on a wagon bench, jolting along a rutted dirt road as the afternoon sun beat down upon them. Thomas slept in her arms, lulled by the steady motion. Neither adult spoke much during the journey, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Rather, it felt like a necessary pause, a chance to catch their breath after the chaos of their meeting. The landscape opened up around them, Promise Creek shrinking behind, while ahead the foothills rose, dotted with pine and aspen. When Lucas finally turned the wagon onto a narrow track that wound up a gentle slope, Harriet caught her first glimpse of his place, a sturdy log cabin nestled against a stand of tall pines, with a small barn and corral to one side. It wasn't grand by any means, but something about the setting, perhaps the way it seemed to belong there, a natural part of the wilderness, made her breath catch. "It's lovely," she said softly. Lucas glanced at her, surprise briefly crossing his features before he nodded. "It does the job." He brought the wagon to a halt before the cabin and jumped down, coming around to help Harriet descend. His hands were strong and calloused, but gentle as they spanned her waist, lifting her effortlessly to the ground. The unexpected contact sent a flutter through her stomach that she attributed to nerves. "Let me show you inside," he said, already moving to retrieve her small carpet bag from the wagon bed. The cabin's interior was simple but well kept. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, which contained a sturdy table with 4 chairs, a leather armchair that had seen better days, and shelves holding books more than Harriet would have expected. A doorway led to what appeared to be a kitchen, while a narrow staircase climbed to what she presumed were bedrooms above. "It's not much," Lucas said, watching her reaction. "It's more than enough," Harriet assured him. "Truly, Mr. Blackwood, I don't know how to thank you." "Lucas," he corrected, "and you don't need to thank me. Just doing what anyone would." But they both knew that wasn't true. Most men wouldn't have taken in a stranger and an infant with no questions asked. There was more to Lucas Blackwood than met the eye. Harriet realized something that made him different from the rough men who populated frontier towns. "I'll show you upstairs," he said, already moving toward the staircase. "Then I've got to see to the horses." The upper floor held 2 bedrooms. The larger clearly belonged to Lucas, with its heavy quilt-covered bed and masculine furnishings. The smaller room contained a narrower bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a simple wooden chest of drawers. "This was my sister's room," Lucas explained, setting Harriet's bag on the bed. When she visited, the past tense wasn't lost on Harriet, but she didn't pry. Everyone out here carried their losses close to their hearts. "It's perfect," she said instead. "Thank you." Left alone, Harriet gently laid Thomas on the bed, surrounding him with pillows to prevent him from rolling. The baby stretched in his sleep, tiny arms extending overhead before settling again. Watching him, Harriet felt the enormity of her responsibility anew. She'd made a promise to her friend, but in the harsh reality of the frontier, good intentions weren't always enough. From the window, she could see Lucas in the yard below, leading the horses toward the barn. His movements were efficient and assured, a man completely at home in his environment. Whatever his story was, he clearly knew this land, this life. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Harriet wondered what tomorrow would bring. For tonight, at least, they had shelter, safety. It would have to be enough. The next morning, Harriet woke to the unfamiliar sounds of a rural homestead rooster's crowing, horses nickering, the distant lowing of cattle. Thomas was already awake beside her, gurgling happily as he played with his toes. The simple joy on his face made her smile despite the uncertainty that pressed at the edges of her mind. After washing and dressing both herself and Thomas, she made her way downstairs to find Lucas already up, stoking the fire in the kitchen stove. "Hope I didn't wake you," he said by way of greeting. "Not at all," Harriet replied, adjusting Thomas on her hip. "We've been imposing on your hospitality enough without sleeping the day away." A ghost of a smile touched Lucas's lips. "Hardly an imposition when I invited you." He nodded toward the stove. "Coffee's nearly ready. There's eggs and bacon too, if you're hungry." Harriet was, in fact, ravenous. She hadn't eaten since a meager meal on the stagecoach the previous day, but she hesitated to accept more charity. "I can cook," she offered. "It's the least I can do." Lucas studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right." He gestured toward a basket on the counter. "Eggs are there. Bacon's in the cold box. I'll take the little one while you work." Before Harriet could protest, he had stepped forward and held out his arms. To her surprise, Thomas went to him willingly, tiny hands immediately reaching for the man's bandana. "You've held babies before," she observed as Lucas effortlessly adjusted the child in his arms. Something flickered across his face, pain, perhaps, or memory. "Once upon a time," was all he said. Harriet busied herself with breakfast preparation, finding the rhythm of working in an unfamiliar kitchen. Despite her curiosity about her taciturn host, she respected his privacy. Everyone had stories they preferred not to tell. Over a surprisingly companionable breakfast, Lucas outlined the day ahead. "I've got cattle to check on the north pasture. Should be back by midday. Make yourself at home." "I can help," Harriet said quickly. "With chores, I mean. I'm not completely helpless around a homestead." Lucas raised an eyebrow. Didn't figure you for helpless, Ms. Monroe. Not after yesterday. Harriet, she corrected. And thank you, I think. That almost smile again. There's laundry needs doing, if you're of a mind. And the vegetable garden could use some attention. Harriet nodded, grateful for the opportunity to be useful. Consider it done. After Lucas rode out, Harriet set about her tasks with determination. She'd grown up on a small farm in Pennsylvania before moving to St. Louis to train as a teacher, so domestic work wasn't foreign to her. With Thomas settled on a blanket in the shade of a large oak tree, she tackled the laundry first, finding satisfaction in the simple, physical labor. As she worked, she studied the homestead more carefully. It was modest but well established, with a fenced vegetable garden, fruit trees, the small barn, and corrals. Beyond these immediate structures, fenced pastures stretched into the distance, dotted with cattle. Lucas clearly wasn't wealthy, but he wasn't struggling either. He'd carved out a life here, a solitary one, it seemed. By midday, when Lucas returned, Harriet had completed the laundry, weeded the garden, and even prepared a simple stew for lunch. Thomas had been fed and was napping peacefully in a makeshift cradle Lucas had brought down from the attic, a detail that added to the mystery of her host. You've been busy, Lucas observed, washing up at the pump outside the kitchen door. Idle hands and all that, Harriet replied with a small smile. Besides, I enjoy feeling useful. Lucas nodded, drying his hands on a towel. Well, you certainly are that. They ate lunch on the porch, taking advantage of the mild spring day. Thomas lay awake in his cradle, occasionally cooing or waving his arms at passing butterflies. What brought you to Promise Creek? Lucas asked suddenly. It was the first personal question he'd posed since their meeting. Harriet set down her bowl. I was hoping to find work as a teacher. My friend Thomas's mother had a cousin here who supposedly needed help with his children. But when I arrived, I discovered he'd moved on to California months ago. And Thomas's father? Killed in a mining accident before Thomas was born. Harriet sighed. My friend, Mary, she held on as long as she could, but the consumption. She trailed off, the memory of Mary's final days still raw. Her last wish was for me to raise Thomas as my own. Lucas's gaze moved to the baby, something unreadable in his eyes. A heavy responsibility to place on a friend. We were more like sisters, Harriet explained. We grew up together in Pennsylvania. When she married and moved west, I never thought I'd see her again. Then last year, after her husband died, she wrote asking if I would come. I'd just lost my position at the school in St. Louis. She shrugged. It seemed like fate. You believe in fate, then? The question held more weight than its simple words suggested. Harriet considered before answering. I believe things happen for reasons we don't always understand at the time, she said finally. Like being in Promise Creek during a bank robbery and meeting you. Lucas held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. The rest of the day passed in companionable work. Lucas showed Harriet around the property, explaining his operations, the cattle herd that provided his main income, the vegetable garden and fruit trees that supplemented their diet, the chickens that supplied eggs. It was a self-sufficient existence, but clearly a solitary one. Don't you get lonely out here? Harriet asked as they walked back toward the cabin, the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. Lucas considered the question. Got used to my own company, I suppose. Town's there when I need it. Otherwise. He gestured toward the sweeping vista before them. The mountains turned purple in the fading light. Hard to feel alone with all this. Harriet understood what he meant. There was something about this place, the vastness of the landscape, the quiet broken only by natural sounds, the star-filled sky that would soon appear overhead that filled rather than emptied the soul. That evening, after Thomas had been fed and put to bed, Harriet joined Lucas on the porch. He'd built a small fire in a stone pit nearby, the flames casting dancing shadows across the yard. Beautiful night, she observed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cooling air. Lucas nodded, offering her a cup of coffee. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, sending an unexpected warmth up Harriet's arm that had nothing to do with the hot beverage. Thank you, she murmured, unsure if she was thanking him for the coffee or for everything else, the shelter, the safety, the unexpected kindness from a stranger. You're welcome to stay, you know, Lucas said after a long silence. Not just for a few days. Until you figure things out. The offer took Harriet by surprise. That's very generous. But I couldn't impose, not an imposition, he interrupted. Place could use a woman's touch. A faint flush colored his cheeks. What I mean is, you're good with the place. Good with chores. And it would help me out, having someone here while I'm working with the herd. Harriet knew there was more to the offer than practical considerations. She'd caught him watching Thomas with an expression that hinted at old wounds, but she appreciated his attempt to frame it as a business arrangement. I'd need to contribute, she insisted. Pay my way somehow. Lucas considered this. You said you're a teacher? Harriet nodded. There's families scattered throughout these hills. Children who don't get much schooling except what their parents can manage. You could teach them, maybe. Use the front room as a schoolhouse during the day. The suggestion kindled immediate interest. Teaching was her calling, her passion. The thought of bringing education to children who might otherwise go without. That could work, she said slowly, ideas already forming. I'd need books, supplies. Next time I go to town, we can see what's available, Lucas offered. And word travels fast out here. Once folks know there's a qualified teacher available, they'll find a way to get their children to you. As they sat in companionable silence, watching the fire and sipping their coffee, Harriet felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Perhaps Thomas's arrival in her life wasn't just a responsibility, but a door opening to possibilities she'd never considered. She glanced at Lucas's profile, outlined against the firelight. He remained a mystery in many ways, but she was beginning to see beyond the stoic exterior to the man beneath, a man of principle and unexpected depth. I'll stay, she said finally, at least until the fall. Lucas turned to her, the firelight reflecting in his gray eyes. Good, he said simply, but the word carried weight. And so began Harriet's new life at the Blackwood Ranch. The days quickly fell into a pattern. Early mornings with Thomas, breakfast with Lucas before he headed out to work the cattle, then household chores interspersed with preparations for her makeshift school. Lucas had spread the word during his next trip to town, and within a week, Harriet had received visits from 3 neighboring families, all eager to arrange lessons for their children. Didn't expect such quick interest, Lucas admitted one evening as they reviewed the list of potential students. Education is precious out here, Harriet replied. These families understand its value, perhaps more than those who take it for granted in the cities. By the second week of June, Harriet's school was operational. The front room of Lucas's cabin had been transformed with a blackboard mounted on one wall, a small bookshelf filled with texts Lucas had purchased in town, and simple benches and tables he'd constructed himself. 8 children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, arrived 3 mornings a week for lessons, brought by parents on horseback or in wagons from surrounding homesteads. Lucas made himself scarce during school hours, but Harriet often caught him lingering near windows or doorways, listening to her lessons with undisguised interest. Once, she found him helping 10-year-old Billy Harper with a particularly challenging arithmetic problem, explaining the concept with surprising patience and clarity. You'd make a fine teacher yourself, she observed after the children had departed. Lucas shook his head, but there was a pleased expression on his face. Just remember some things from my own school days. Where was that? Harriet asked, seizing the rare opportunity to learn more about his past. A shadow crossed his face. Back east, Massachusetts. He offered no more, turning instead to ask about Thomas, who was becoming a favorite among the students. As spring yielded to summer, the landscape transformed. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, trees burst into full leaf, and the days stretched long and golden. Harriet found herself settling into life at the ranch with surprising ease. What had begun as a temporary arrangement was beginning to feel like home. The change in Thomas was even more remarkable. The once frail infant was now a robust baby, sitting up on his own, babbling constantly, and regarding the world with bright, curious eyes. His attachment to Lucas grew stronger each day, his face lighting up whenever the man entered a room. And Lucas? Harriet noticed the gradual softening in him, the way his taciturn nature gave way to occasional smiles, even laughter when Thomas did something particularly charming. He began sharing stories from his day's work, asking about her lessons, lingering at the table after meals rather than immediately retreating to solitary tasks. One hot July afternoon, As Harriet hung laundry while Thomas napped indoors, Lucas appeared unexpectedly, leading his horse back from the pastures earlier than usual. "Everything all right?" she called, concerned by his unscheduled return. He nodded, tying the horse to the rail. "Thought you might like to see something." Curious, Harriet checked on Thomas still sleeping soundly, then followed Lucas to the barn. Inside, in a stall lined with fresh straw, lay one of his mares with a tiny foal curled beside her. "Born this morning," Lucas explained, his voice gentle. "First one of the season." Harriet gasped softly at the sight. The foal was exquisite, all spindly legs and large eyes, its coat a rich chestnut, like its mother's. "She's beautiful," Harriet whispered, kneeling at a respectful distance. Lucas corrected. "It's a colt." "Does he have a name?" Lucas shook his head. "Thought you might want to do the honors." The simple gesture, including her in something so personal to his livelihood, touched Harriet deeply. "I'd be honored. Let me think." She studied the foal, watching as he nuzzled against his mother. "Promise," she decided finally. "After Promise Creek, where we met." Lucas nodded slowly. "Promise it is." He offered his hand to help Harriet rise, and when their fingers interlaced, neither was quick to let go. Standing there in the dim light of the barn, their hands still joined, Harriet felt a shift between them, a recognition of something that had been building gradually over the weeks they'd shared this life. Lucas's eyes held hers, and for a moment, she thought he might say something, might acknowledge what was happening. Instead, a cry from the house, Thomas awakening from his nap, broke the spell. Harriet reluctantly pulled her hand away. "I should go to him," she said, her voice not quite steady. Lucas nodded. "I'll finish up here, then come in." Harriet hurried back to the house, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with her brisk pace. Whatever was growing between them, it was becoming harder to ignore. That evening, after Thomas had been put to bed, Lucas surprised Harriet by suggesting they ride up to a nearby ridge. "There's a view there," he explained. "Best seen at sunset." Curious and eager for the chance to explore beyond the immediate homestead, Harriet readily agreed. Lucas saddled 2 horses, his own sturdy gelding and a gentle mare he kept for occasional guests. "You ride much?" he asked as he helped her mount. "It's been years," Harriet admitted, "but I grew up around horses." Lucas nodded approvingly. "Just follow my lead. It's not far." They rode at a leisurely pace, the horses picking their way along a narrow trail that wound upward through stands of pine and aspen. The air grew cooler as they climbed, carrying the scent of wildflowers and sun-warmed earth. Harriet relaxed into the rhythm of her mount, enjoying the freedom of movement after days confined to domestic duties. Lucas rode slightly ahead, occasionally glancing back to ensure she was managing the trail. In these unguarded moments, Harriet caught glimpses of the man beneath the stoic exterior, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the careful attention he paid to his surroundings, the gentle hands that guided his horse with minimal pressure. When they reached the ridge, Lucas dismounted and helped Harriet down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Then he led her to the edge of a natural clearing. "There," he said simply, gesturing outward. Harriet's breath caught. Before them, the land fell away in a spectacular panorama, rolling foothills giving way to the vast plains beyond, all bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. In the far distance, the faint outline of Promise Creek was visible, a tiny outpost of civilization in the wilderness. "It's magnificent," she whispered. Lucas nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Found this place my first week here. Come up sometimes when I need to." "Remember?" "Remember what?" Harriet asked softly. He was quiet, so long she thought he might not answer. "Then, why I came west. What I was looking for. And did you find it?" Again, that long pause. "Parts of it." They stood in silence as the sun continued its descent, painting the sky in ever-changing hues of orange, pink, and purple. Lucas had brought a blanket, which he spread on a flat rock for them to sit on. From saddlebags, he produced a small bundle containing bread, cheese, and a jar of preserves, a simple picnic. As they ate, watching darkness claim the landscape, Lucas began to speak. Slowly at first, then with increasing fluency, he told Harriet of his life before Promise Creek, his childhood in Massachusetts as the son of a prosperous merchant, his marriage at 22 to his childhood sweetheart, their dreams of family and future. Sarah was everything to me, he said, his voice low. Smart, beautiful, kind. We had it all planned out: the house we'd build, the family we'd raise, the life we'd share. Harriet listened, sensing the weight of what was to come. She was carrying our first child when the fever hit our town. Lucas continued. Took half the population in a month. Sarah. His voice faltered. She lingered longer than most. Fought hard. But in the end, I lost them both, her and our unborn son. Oh, Lucas, Harriet breathed, instinctively reaching for his hand in the growing darkness. His fingers tightened around hers. Couldn't stay after that. Too many memories. Headed west with nothing but the clothes on my back and Sarah's pendant. He touched his chest, where Harriet had sometimes glimpsed a small silver object hanging from a leather cord beneath his shirt. Worked cattle drives, ranch jobs, whatever came my way. Eventually saved enough for this place. How long ago? Harriet asked gently. 7 years since I lost them. 5 since I settled here. The revelation explained so much: his solitary existence, his initial hesitation with Thomas, the shadows that sometimes crossed his face when watching the baby. Thank you for telling me, Harriet said. I know it can't be easy to speak of such things. Lucas turned toward her, his face half illuminated by the rising moon. Haven't told anyone since coming west. Never felt the need until... He paused. Until you and Thomas arrived. The admission hung between them, weighted with implication. Harriet's heart quickened as Lucas's hand tightened around hers. Harriet, he began, then seemed to struggle for words. But whatever he intended to say was interrupted by a distant rumble of thunder. Lucas looked up sharply at the sky, where clouds were gathering to the west, obscuring the stars. Storm's coming, he said, rising quickly. We should head back. They packed up hurriedly and mounted their horses, beginning the descent just as the first fat droplets of rain began to fall. By the time they reached the halfway point, the storm had intensified, rain falling in sheets that made the trail treacherous. Stay close, Lucas called over the wind, guiding his horse carefully down the increasingly muddy path. Harriet followed his lead, but suddenly her mare shied at a flash of lightning, nearly unseating her. Lucas was beside her in an instant, reaching across to steady her with a strong arm. Almost there, he encouraged. Just a little further. They made it back to the ranch as the storm reached its peak, thunder crashing overhead and rain pounding against the earth. They stabled the horses quickly, then ran for the house, arriving on the porch soaked to the skin and breathless. Inside, they found Thomas still sleeping peacefully, undisturbed by the storm's fury. After checking on him, Harriet returned downstairs to find Lucas building up the fire, his wet shirt clinging to the muscled contours of his back. You should change before you catch cold, he said, not turning around. So should you, she replied, suddenly aware of her own sodden appearance, her dress plastered to her body in a way that left little to the imagination. Lucas glanced over his shoulder, and something in his gaze changed as he took in her rain-drenched form. He straightened slowly, turning to face her fully. Harriet, he said, his voice rough with an emotion she hadn't heard from him before. The air between them seemed to crackle with the same electricity that lit the sky outside. Harriet stood frozen, water dripping from her hair onto the wooden floor, aware of every beat of her heart, every breath she took. Lucas moved toward her with deliberate steps until he stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised a hand to her face, gently brushing a strand of wet hair from her cheek. I never expected to feel this way again, he murmured. Never thought I'd want to. Harriet leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. Neither did I. The confession hung between them for one breathless moment. Then Lucas lowered his head, and his lips found hers in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened with months of unspoken longing. Harriet's arms wound around his neck as she responded with equal fervor, all the feelings she'd been holding back breaking free at last. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. Been wanting to do that since I saw you hanging laundry in the sunshine, singing to Thomas like he was your own. Harriet smiled, her hands still clasped behind his neck. I've been wanting you to since the day you helped Billy Harper with his arithmetic. Lucas laughed softly, the sound warming her more than the nearby fire. "We've been fools, haven't we?" "Perhaps," she agreed. "Or perhaps we needed time to know each other, to be sure." He nodded, his expression growing serious. "I am sure, Harriet. More sure than I've been of anything in a very long time." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "So am I." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the cabin's walls, something new and precious had taken root, a second chance at happiness for two people who had thought such things might be forever beyond their reach. The following weeks brought a subtle but significant shift in the household's dynamics. Lucas and Harriet moved carefully at first, both aware of the fragility of their newfound connection. They kept their growing relationship private, maintaining propriety when Harriet's students or neighboring ranchers visited. But in the quiet evenings after Thomas was asleep, they allowed themselves to explore this unexpected gift, sharing stories of their pasts, dreams of their futures, and increasingly passionate embraces by the firelight. August arrived with blazing heat that turned the grass golden and made the air shimmer above the distant plains. Thomas celebrated his first birthday with a small cake Harriet baked using precious sugar reserved for special occasions. Lucas presented the boy with a hand-carved wooden horse, its details so fine that Harriet marveled at the hours of secret work it must have required. "It's beautiful," she said as Thomas clutched the toy with delighted squeals. "When did you find time to make it?" Lucas shrugged, but his eyes shone with pleasure at the child's reaction. "Found moments here and there. Wanted him to have something special." The way he said it, casual, yet filled with genuine care, made Harriet's heart swell. Lucas had become a true father figure to Thomas, teaching him with the same patience he showed his horses, delighting in each new accomplishment from first steps to first words. "Lou," Thomas called now, reaching pudgy arms toward Lucas. It was his attempt at Lucas, the closest he could manage, and his favorite word besides mama, which he had begun calling Harriet to her secret joy. Lucas scooped him up, settling the boy against his broad chest with practiced ease. "Happy birthday, little man," he murmured, dropping a kiss on the dark curls. Watching them together, Harriet felt a completeness she hadn't known was possible. What had begun as a desperate situation, a woman alone with a child not her own, without resources or prospects, had transformed into something rich and meaningful. She had found not just shelter but purpose in her teaching, not just security but love in Lucas's arms. But shadows lingered at the edges of this happiness. Harriet had promised to stay only until fall, and though neither had mentioned it since that night by the fire, the unspoken question of the future hung between them. She had no desire to leave, yet pride kept her from presuming a permanent place in Lucas's life without a clear invitation. The question remained unaddressed until a late August evening when an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch. Harriet was working in the garden while Thomas played nearby in a shaded pen Lucas had constructed when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. A rider appeared on the road from town, a man she didn't recognize, middle-aged and well-dressed despite the dust of travel. Lucas emerged from the barn at the same moment, crossing the yard to meet the visitor as he dismounted. "Afternoon," the stranger greeted, removing his hat. "You must be Blackwood." Lucas nodded, his stance wary. "Can I help you?" "Name's Jonathan Prescott. I'm the new county superintendent of schools." The man's gaze shifted to Harriet, who had moved to stand protectively near Thomas. "And you, I presume, are Miss Monroe?" Harriet straightened, brushing soil from her skirt. "I am." Prescott smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "Word of your little school has reached Promise Creek. Quite the reputation you're building." "The children are eager learners," Harriet replied cautiously. "Indeed." Prescott glanced around the homestead. "I've come with a proposition, Miss Monroe. The town council has approved funds for a proper schoolhouse in Promise Creek. We're seeking a qualified teacher to take the position permanently, beginning next month. The salary is modest, but includes accommodations above the schoolroom. Given your experience and the unusual circumstances of your current arrangement, I thought you might be interested." The offer caught Harriet completely off guard. A permanent teaching position had been her original goal in coming to Wyoming territory. Under normal circumstances, she would have accepted immediately, grateful for the opportunity and security it represented. But circumstances were far from normal now. She glanced at Lucas, whose face had gone carefully blank, revealing nothing of his thoughts. This is unexpected, she managed. I would need time to consider. Prescott nodded. Of course. The position begins September 15th. I'll need your answer by next week. He handed her an envelope. Details are all here, including salary and expectations. After declining an offer of refreshment, Prescott remounted his horse. I'll call again next Friday for your decision, Miss Monroe. Good day to you both. As the dust from his departure settled, an uncomfortable silence fell between Harriet and Lucas. Thomas, oblivious to the tension, continued playing happily with his wooden blocks. You should take it, Lucas said finally, his voice unnaturally even. It's what you came here for. Harriet felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Is that what you want? Lucas didn't answer directly. It's a good opportunity. Steady pay, your own place in town. Better for you than out here, especially come winter. And what about Thomas? She asked, trying to keep the hurt from her voice. What about us? Lucas turned away slightly, his profile rigid against the afternoon sun. Town's not far. You could bring him to visit. Visit. The word fell between them like a stone. After everything they'd shared, was that all he envisioned for their future? Occasional visits? I see, Harriet said, struggling to maintain her composure. Well, as you said, it's a good opportunity. I'll consider it carefully. She gathered Thomas and his toys, heading for the house without looking back. Inside, she placed the unopened envelope on the table and busied herself with dinner preparations, methodically chopping vegetables while blinking back tears that threatened to fall. Lucas didn't come in until after sunset. He ate the meal she'd prepared in near silence, responding to her attempts at conversation with monosyllables. After helping with the washing up a routine they'd established together, he announced he needed to check on a pregnant mare in the barn. Don't wait up, he added, not meeting her eyes. Might be late. Harriet nodded, watching him go with a heaviness in her chest. She put Thomas to bed, then sat on the porch alone, the envelope from Prescott in her hands. The rational part of her knew she should open it, evaluate the offer based on its merits. A guaranteed position with housing was more security than she'd had in years. But her heart rebelled at the thought of leaving this place, this home they'd built together, the life they'd begun to shape. How could Lucas dismiss it so easily? Unless what she'd thought was deep and mutual feeling was something less to him, comfort, perhaps, or convenience. The idea was like a physical pain. Harriet sat in the darkness, tears finally flowing freely as she confronted the possibility that she'd misread everything between them. It was well past midnight when Lucas finally returned. Harriet had dried her tears and was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of long cold tea, the unopened envelope still before her. He paused in the doorway, surprise crossing his features at finding her still awake. Thought you'd be asleep, he said gruffly. Couldn't, she replied simply. He moved to the stove, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot she'd left warming. His back was to her as he spoke. Major decision yet? Something in his tone of forced casualness that didn't quite mask tension gave Harriet pause. Have you made yours? She countered quietly. Lucas turned, confusion evident on his face. Mine. Yes, Lucas. Yours. Harriet straightened in her chair. Because this isn't just my decision. Not anymore. Not after everything that's happened between us. He set his cup down carefully. The teaching position is what you wanted. What you came to Promise Creek to find in the first place. That was before, Harriet said, her voice gaining strength. Before Thomas. Before this place. Before you. She stood, moving toward him. I thought we were building something here together. Was I wrong? Lucas's expression tightened. You deserve better than this, Harriet. A real home in town, not a rough cabin miles from anywhere. Proper society, not a recluse with too many shadows in his past. Understanding dawned suddenly. You're not trying to send me away, she realized. You're trying to give me what you think I want. What you think I deserve. He looked away. It's the right thing. The right thing. Harriet repeated incredulously. By whose measure? Not mine, certainly. She stepped closer, forcing him to meet her gaze. Do you want me to go, Lucas? Truly. The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Lucas's face worked with emotion, his careful control slipping. No, he said finally, the word barely audible. God help me, I want you to stay. You and Thomas. But I have no right to ask that of you. Relief washed through Harriet, followed quickly by frustration. Why not? Why shouldn't you ask for what you want? What we both want. Because I've done this before. Lucas's voice rose unexpectedly. Made plans, built dreams. And when it all fell apart, he trailed off, pain etching deep lines around his eyes. I can't go through that again, Harriet. I can't risk losing, so you'd rather push me away first? Harriet demanded. Deny yourself, deny us a chance at happiness because you're afraid. The accusation struck home. She could see it in the way he flinched. It's not that simple. It is that simple, Harriet insisted. Life offers no guarantees, Lucas. Not to any of us. Sarah understood that. I'm certain of it. She wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life alone because you're afraid of losing again. Lucas stared at her, speechless at the direct reference to his wife. Harriet pressed her advantage. I love you, she said plainly. And I believe you love me too. If I'm wrong, tell me now, and I'll take Prescott's offer and go to town. But if I'm right. She took a deep breath. If I'm right, then stop pushing me away and ask me to stay. The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. Harriet could hear her own heartbeat, feel the trembling in her hands as she waited for Lucas to speak, to act, to give some sign of his true feelings. When he finally moved, it was with a suddenness that startled her. His arms came around her, pulling her against his chest with an almost desperate strength. Stay, he whispered hoarsely against her hair. God, Harriet, please stay. I do love you more than I thought possible, more than I ever believed I could love again. You and Thomas, you've brought life back to this place. Back to me. Harriet clung to him, tears of relief flowing freely. Then that's my answer, she said. That's all I need to hear. Lucas drew back, just enough to frame her face with his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. I'm sorry, he murmured. I thought I was doing right by you, giving you a choice. Should have known you'd make your own. A watery laugh escaped her. You should have. His expression grew serious. But Harriet, if you stay, I want it to be proper, permanent. He took a deep breath. I'm asking you to marry me, to be my wife. Thomas's mother in every way that matters. Joy bloomed in Harriet's chest, spreading warmth to every part of her being. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. The smile that transformed Lucas's face was like sunrise after the longest night, brilliant, life-giving. He lowered his head to kiss her with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept and futures shared. Later, as dawn approached, they sat together on the porch, Lucas's arm around Harriet's shoulders as they watched the eastern sky lighten. What will you tell Prescott? Lucas asked. Harriet leaned against him, content in a way she'd never known before. That I'm grateful for the offer, but I've accepted another position as a wife, mother, and teacher to the children of these hills. Lucas's arm tightened around her. Not the future you planned when you came west. No, she agreed, turning to look up at him. It's better. The autumn wedding of Lucas Blackwood and Harriet Monroe became something of a local legend in Promise Creek and the surrounding homesteads. Held in the yard of their ranch beneath an arbor Lucas constructed from aspen branches, the ceremony drew neighbors for miles around, many of whom had come to know Harriet through her teaching or Lucas through years of quiet assistance offered in hard times. Harriet wore a gown of ivory silk ordered specially from Denver, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Thomas, now toddling confidently, served as ring-bearer, carefully carrying a small pillow with the simple gold bands Lucas had purchased on a trip to Cheyenne. The reception lasted well into the evening, with music provided by a fiddler from town and food contributed by neighboring families. As twilight fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, casting a golden glow over the celebration. Happy? Lucas asked, finding a moment alone with his new wife as their guests danced and laughed nearby. Harriet looked up at him, at the man who had transformed from taciturn stranger to beloved husband in the space of 6 months. Completely, she answered truthfully. His arm slipped around her waist, drawing her close. Never thought I'd have this again, he murmured. A family, a home that's more than just shelter. Nor I, Harriet replied, thinking of the uncertain woman who had stepped off the stagecoach with a baby not her own and no clear path forward. It's strange how life works sometimes. Lucas nodded, his gaze moving to where Thomas played with the other children, his laughter carrying across the yard. "That boy's going to have brothers and sisters," he said with quiet certainty. "A whole houseful, if you're willing." Warmth spread through Harriet at the thought. More children, a growing family in this place they'd made their own. "I'm willing," she assured him, leaning into his solid strength. More than willing. As their guests began to depart with congratulations and well wishes, Lucas built up the fire pit in the yard. He and Harriet sat beside it long after the last wagon had disappeared down the road, Thomas sleeping peacefully in his father's arms. The night air carried the first hint of autumn's approach, a crispness that promised change while speaking of harvest and abundance. Stars spread across the vast Wyoming sky, more than Harriet had ever imagined possible during her years in the East. "All I need is you, a fire, and a sun," Lucas said softly, echoing words he'd spoken that first day on the porch when Harriet had arrived, weary and uncertain, at his door. Didn't know how true those words would become. Harriet reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. "They were always true," she said. "You just needed to believe them." Lucas nodded, his gaze moving from the sleeping child to the woman who had brought such unexpected joy to his life. "I believe them now," he said, "with all my heart." And as they sat together beneath the endless sky, the fire casting its warm light around them, Harriet knew they had found what so many search for, but few truly discover: not just love or passion or comfort, but home in its deepest sense. A place to belong, to grow, to build a life worth living. The promise of that future stretched before them like the vast Wyoming landscape, challenging at times, perhaps, but beautiful beyond measure and entirely their own. Winter came early that year, the first snow falling in late October and blanketing the ranch in pristine white. For Harriet, who had known only city winters, the transformation was magical. The way the landscape changed overnight, how the air became so crisp it seemed to shatter with each breath, the absolute silence that fell during heavy snowfalls. Lucas had spent the weeks before the first storm preparing, stacking firewood, reinforcing the barn, ensuring adequate feed was stored for the livestock. "Winters here can be harsh," he'd explained as they worked together. "Beautiful, but unforgiving if you're not ready." Now, as December settled in with short days and long nights, Harriet was grateful for his foresight. The cabin remained warm and snug regardless of the weather outside, with fires burning in both the kitchen stove and the main room's fireplace. Her small school continued despite the season, with the most determined families bringing their children by sled on clear days. Thomas thrived in the winter environment, his cheeks pink with cold as Lucas taught him to make snow angels and build tiny snowmen in the yard. At 18 months, he was talking more each day, his vocabulary expanding to include words like snow, cold, and horse, the latter being his constant request, as Lucas had begun taking him for short rides on his gentlest mare. Christmas approached with quiet anticipation. Having grown up with modest Pennsylvania traditions, Harriet was determined to create meaningful celebrations in their frontier home. She dried apples and berries for decorations, sewed small gifts for Thomas and Lucas, and planned a special meal incorporating preserved foods from their summer garden. Lucas, she discovered, had his own ideas about the holiday. One afternoon in mid-December, he disappeared with the wagon, returning at dusk with a small pine tree secured in the back. "Thought we could put it in the corner of the main room," he said almost shyly as Harriet came out to meet him. "Used to have one when I was a boy." Together they set up the tree, decorating it with the dried fruit garlands Harriet had made, pine cones collected from the forest edge, and small carved wooden ornaments Lucas produced from a box he'd kept stored in the attic, remnants, Harriet realized, of his life before, preserved despite the pain of remembering. "These are beautiful," she said softly, holding a delicate wooden star. "Did you make them?" Lucas nodded, watching as she hung it on a branch. "My father taught me. Made a new one each Christmas for Sarah." His voice held no bitterness now when speaking of his first wife, just a gentle remembrance that Harriet had encouraged rather than feared. "Stopped after." "Well, just stopped. But I kept them." Harriet touched his arm, understanding the significance of bringing these treasures out again. "I'm glad you did." On Christmas morning, they exchanged simple gifts by the fire, warm knitted items, books ordered from catalogs, small luxuries like coffee and sugar. For Thomas, Lucas had crafted a rocking horse, meticulously detailed and perfectly sized for the toddler, who immediately climbed aboard with squeals of delight. "I have one more gift," Lucas said when the others had been opened. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Harriet unwrapped it carefully to reveal a silver locket on a delicate chain. Opening it, she found a tiny portrait of Thomas on one side, while the other held a lock of dark hair. "It's perfect," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "There's more," Lucas said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. He took her hand, placing something small and cool in her palm. Harriet looked down to see a simple gold band with a small pearl set into the metal, different from her wedding ring, more delicate. "It was my mother's," Lucas explained. "She left it to me for my daughter someday." He cleared his throat. "I thought you should have it now, because I'm with child," Harriet finished for him. The surprise she'd been keeping these past weeks finally spoken aloud. Lucas stared at her, momentarily speechless. "You're certain?" She nodded, joy bubbling up inside her. "Dr. Paulson confirmed it when he was here last week for Emily Walker's cough. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Lucas's face transformed with wonder and delight. In one fluid motion, he was kneeling before her chair, his arms encircling her waist, his head resting against her still flat abdomen. "A baby," he murmured. "Our baby. Due in June," Harriet said, running her fingers through his hair. "Dr. Paulson says everything looks healthy." Lucas looked up at her, eyes bright with unshed tears. "You've given me back everything I thought was lost forever, Harriet. Everything and more." She leaned down to kiss him, this man who had become the center of her world. "We've given it to each other." That night, after Thomas was asleep in the small room that adjoined theirs, Lucas and Harriet lay together in the darkness, his hand resting protectively over her stomach. "What do you hope for?" she asked softly. "A son or daughter?" Lucas considered the question. "Healthy, first and foremost," he said finally. "But a daughter would be." He paused, searching for the right word. "Special. A little girl with your spirit and intelligence." Harriet smiled in the darkness. "And your strength and kindness." "Poor child, saddled with our combined stubbornness." Lucas chuckled, pulling her closer. "She'll manage," Harriet replied confidently, with Thomas to show her the way. The remainder of winter passed in a gentle rhythm of daily chores, quiet evenings, and planning for the future. Lucas added a room to the cabin, working on mild days with help from neighboring ranchers. Harriet continued teaching while beginning to sew small garments for the baby, often sitting by the fire in the evenings with Thomas playing at her feet, while Lucas read aloud from one of their precious books. Spring arrived in a rush of melting snow and sudden greenery, the land coming alive after months of white silence. The pregnant mare delivered a healthy foal, a filly Lucas named Liberty for her independent spirit. Thomas, now nearing his second birthday, followed his father everywhere, helping with chores and developing a natural affinity for the horses that made Lucas beam with pride. As Harriet's pregnancy progressed, her school sessions became less frequent, with the older students often coming to help with lessons for the younger ones. The community that had formed around their homestead continued to grow, with Sunday gatherings becoming a regular occurrence, families bringing food to share, men discussing crops and cattle, while women exchanged recipes and child-rearing advice. On a warm June evening, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, Harriet felt the first contractions. Lucas sent their nearest neighbor riding for the midwife in Promise Creek, then settled Thomas with another family before returning to Harriet's side. The labor progressed swiftly, too swiftly for the midwife to arrive in time. With only Lucas to help her, Harriet brought their daughter into the world as the first stars appeared in the night sky. "She's perfect," Lucas whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he placed the swaddled infant in Harriet's arms. "Absolutely perfect." The baby had a dusting of dark hair and eyes that, when briefly opened, showed hints of the gray that matched her father's. Her tiny hands waved in the air before finding and grasping Lucas's offered finger with surprising strength. "What shall we name her?" Harriet asked, exhausted but radiantly happy. Lucas gazed at his daughter, wonder evident in every line of his face. "Sarah," he said softly, "if that's all right with you. Sarah Hope Blackwood." Tears welled in Harriet's eyes at the gesture, not just the honoring of his first wife, but the pairing of that name with hope, a testament to the future they were building together. "It's perfect," she assured him. "Sarah, hope it is." When the midwife finally arrived, she found the small family already settled, baby nursing contentedly, father watching over mother and child with tender vigilance. She checked both Harriet and Sarah, pronouncing them healthy before preparing a restorative tea for the new mother. "You did well," she told Lucas as she prepared to leave. Not many men would have managed so calmly. Lucas shook his head. "It was all Harriet," he said simply. "She's the strongest person I know." The midwife smiled knowingly. "That's as may be, but it takes a special kind of man to recognize such strength and value it. You two have built something rare here." She gestured around the cabin, which had evolved from Lucas's solitary dwelling to a true family home. Something that will last. After she departed, Lucas brought Thomas to meet his sister. The toddler approached the bed cautiously, climbing up beside Harriet to peer at the tiny bundle in her arms. "Baby?" he asked, his expression serious. "Yes, sweetheart," Harriet confirmed. "This is your sister, Sarah." Thomas studied the infant carefully, then reached out to touch her cheek with gentle fingers. "My Sarah," he declared with the certainty only a 2-year-old could muster. Lucas settled beside them on the bed, his arm around Harriet's shoulders, his other hand resting lightly on Thomas's back. "That's right, son," he said quietly. "Your sister, our family." Harriet leaned against him, content in a way she'd never imagined possible during those uncertain days following Mary's death. The path that had led her here to this man, these children, this life had been neither straight nor easy. But sitting in the warm glow of the lamp, surrounded by love made all the more precious for having been unexpected, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. "I love you," she whispered to Lucas, the words simple but carrying the weight of everything they'd built together. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "And I love you," he replied. "Always will." As night deepened outside their window, the stars spreading across the vast Wyoming sky like diamonds scattered on velvet, the Blackwood family slept peacefully in their cabin on the hill. Lucas and Harriet, Thomas and baby Sarah, two people who had found each other against all odds, and the children who were the living embodiment of their love and hope for the future. In the years that followed, the ranch prospered along with the family. Lucas expanded his cattle operation, eventually becoming one of the most respected ranchers in the territory. Harriet's school grew into a proper building constructed by the community, where she taught not only reading and arithmetic, but music, art, and the natural sciences she had always loved. Thomas grew into a tall, thoughtful young man with his mother Mary's kind eyes and the quiet strength Lucas had instilled in him. Sarah became a spirited girl with Harriet's intelligence and her father's determination. They were joined by 2 more siblings, William, born 3 years after Sarah, and Elizabeth, who arrived 2 years later to complete the family. Promise Creek expanded into a proper town with a railway station, bringing new settlers and opportunities. But through all the changes, the Blackwood Ranch remained a constant, a place of warmth and welcome, of hard work and simple joys, of a love that had begun with 2 wounded souls finding unexpected healing in each other's arms. On cool evenings, long after the children were grown with families of their own, Lucas and Harriet could still be found sitting by the fire on their porch, hands clasped as they watched the stars emerge above their beloved mountains. "All I need is you, a fire, and our family," Lucas would often say, an echo of words spoken decades earlier, but now infused with the richness of a life fully lived. And Harriet, gray now threading her dark hair, but her eyes as bright as ever, would smile and lean against the shoulder of the man who had taught her the true meaning of home. "That's all any of us really need," she would reply. "That's everything."